morning. It's Sunday morning at 9:30 here at the High Mountain Presbyterian Church, March the 22nd, 2020. These are the days that we will want to talk to our grandchildren about. These are the days that our children will want to talk to their grandchildren about. Days that are unfolding and the outcome of which we try to imagine and hope for the best. Today we are continuing in a series here which was planned before any of this. Those of you that know me know I'm not one that's given to planning 4 and 5 months in advance and then following that plan. I respond more to a kind of contemporaneousness in my life, and that suits me. But for some reason this year, I made a plan. I made a whole documented plan for 6-7 weeks. I made the plan 2 months before those 6 or 7 weeks began, and I liked it. I liked the experience of it, but wow, am I ever grateful for having in place all the sermon titles and all the scripture lessons, and I even gave Chris the hymns early so that she could prepare the bulletins for the worship service, most of which we have not been able to use. But the reason I'm saying that is it comes to a morning like this morning where we have a topic which specifically was titled, "How does the church ensure that it is a safe place?" And wow, has the context and the reverberation of that context changed since I first thought about the reasons for having that as a topic and what I might say in response to it. Safety is a big concern in our world today, in the United States and in the global community. How do we find safety? How can we be safe? You hear the president talk about an invisible enemy. These aren't words that normally come to the forefront in our lives. There's always risk, there's always hazards. But today we're focusing more on a specific pursuit of safety from a specific kind of threat. And so I want to say, I'm not going to do everything I was originally going to do in this class, because I think there's an immediacy to my prayers for safety for you all, for safety for your loved ones, safety for those that are going into harm's way, in order to create caring and ministry for others. This is a great thing in the presence of a terrible thing. This is a marvelous thing that we are working together to create as safe an environment as we can for each other, given the threat that is upon us. So I'm encouraging you, if you haven't already started it, to stay home. Stay at home and try to find the least amount of ways of contact that you can have. This virus lives on surfaces. You've heard all of this. But I want to reiterate it, because they say in human learning you should tell them and then tell them what you told them and then tell them again. So I need to be told, I need to be reminded, this is a whole sea change, a life change for many of us. And we need to be reminded of why. So we do this for our own safety, but in some ways the larger topic that is in front of us and the larger challenge to the great number of people in the world is, can we do this for the safety of others? Can we do this to minimize the threat to others, especially if we're 25 years old or 35 years old and hear the statistics that say this isn't really going to affect you, or if you get sick, it's not really going to hurt you. Can we exercise that altruism, that otherness, the care for the other, that would lead us to rearrange our lives out of compassion and care and safety and protection of others? Now, strangely, that paragraph, that topic brings us back around again to a smaller context for how do we make church safe. We call the gathering place of the church a sanctuary, which a sanctuary is supposed to be a place where all harms and threats that you might have to defend yourself against out there in the world or out there in the general population are somehow minimized or controlled or not present here. This is a sanctuary. It has been a sanctuary for political refugees. The Presbyterian Church has been proud over the years to declare that sanctuary is a real sanctuary. It's not just a spiritual sanctuary. It is that, but it's a physical sanctuary for those who are being pursued or those who seek shelter. Shelter in natural disasters. It's almost a done deal that congregations are considered places of safety and shelter, even by the federal government, where we file writs of understanding and say that when the time comes, this place, this building, the facilities that we have are to be used for the safety of the world, of the safety and sanctuary of the general population. That's at the root of our understanding, our existence as beings. Now let me talk then about the flip side of it. Church communities are not always safe. And if they're going to be safe, if they're really going to be safe communities, they will only be safe communities if the community itself is aware of threats that can exist in a community and is willing to take the steps necessary, uncomfortable or awkward or maybe unpopular, that are required in order to ensure that this is a safe place. When I was a young pastor, there are two incidents that come to mind from one of the first churches that I served, and my growing awareness of what the challenge of being a church really was. The first one had to do with my own daughters. At the time, I had 3 daughters and a son. They were all in the eeny-weeny and larger stage. And I was a young pastor. I was coming to a large Presbyterian church, and I'm dragging them with me, them following along, sometimes very happily, and marching up the steps of the church on Sunday morning, and arriving as the pastor to be greeted by others who share authority and responsibility in the church. This is how we organize. We have some who are appointed with authority, with power, if you will. And a little side note here that has to do with my understanding of this is human beings love power. We do. We love it. It helps the molecules of our body to get excited. We love power. And the difficulty with it is that when it's given to us, when authority is given to us, it has a tendency to change us a little bit, sometimes a lot. But the weird thing about being given authority and power is that we like to exercise it. We like to exercise it. We like to see it in practice. We like that. It warms our hearts. And then the other thing is that we are often insecure about how to maintain that power. And so those two things, our liking of exercising it and then the insecurity about maintaining it, makes us as human beings who receive power and authority, it can make us into people who are not safe to be around. Now let me go back to my story. So this church, long-established church, I was happy to be there as a pastor and to share leadership and power with other people. But what I found on a Sunday morning, very surprising and then further very unsettling to me, was that as I brought my family up to the doors of the church, their custom was that those who shared in authority and power stood alternately, taking turns at the door, and they greeted people, even the pastor. So a handshake, a smile, a comment between the pastor and the elder was considered normal fare in the public exchange. My children who were relatively new in the community, because I had just come there as a pastor, were walking behind me, and they were not exactly comfortable with this casual exchange with someone that they did not know. Now, I would have thought most people would have understood that. But in this particular case, as I walked up with my children, this male elder got what he wanted, and we did our exchange of mutuality, and then he turned to my children. And it fully expected that given, I guess, I'm filling in his thoughts, that given his position and authority, that he would extend his hand and expect a reciprocation. My children, on the other, although my children did not, that is not what was going on in their head. In their head, this was a stranger. This was a stranger who was reaching out and reaching into their personal space and expecting something from them, and they responded by running behind me. And they were not little tiny children. They got behind me. They got behind me like an infant lamb would get behind its mother when it perceived a threat. To me, in my world, the threat was understandable. I said it was fine. It was clear in my world that this was expected for children when approached by a male who was exercising his role, his given role, his authority. He was trying to do what he's supposed to do, but also what he liked to do. And then the moment was gone. The children went around behind me, avoided him, and went on in to do what they were doing in church. I thought the issue was over. Until we came to the meeting of the church council at the end of the month, and this person was a member of the church council, and he decided that he was going to add to the agenda the inappropriate behavior of the pastor, the associate pastor's children. I was floored, especially as he described what to him, I'm putting the words that frame this out there, was an affront to his authority. And he was calling on me to make sure that I was going to change my children's behavior to conform with the position that he'd been given and with the simple kindness that he had simply extended. Why didn't you train your children to greet the elders as they come in and to smile and shake their hand and do what's necessary? You need to do that. You need to get going on that, Pastor, was the message that came from this elder. I had to calm my rage a little bit. Honestly, it did infuriate me that I was even in this moment. And fortunately, my thoughts came together in this way. And I said to him, with as much respect in my rage as I could, I said, I think there seems to be some misunderstanding, and maybe it's cultural values. But I said, I raise my children, especially my girls, given the plight of women in human history. I raise them not to be so concerned at first with expectations and maintaining a social order of things and giving due diligence to those who are in authority. Not first, teach that. But first, I teach them to pay attention to how they feel. Now, clearly that was a generational thing, right? But I said, I tell my children that when they are in a situation where they are afraid, that they should pay attention to that and they should respond accordingly. They should not ignore how they feel. They should not ignore the possibility of an approach that feels to them like an unwelcomed invasion into their space. This I actually taught them in words. And I told them that as their father, that I would have their back, that I would endorse that kind of response because I was concerned for their safety. And I was not as concerned, did not feel like I needed to be concerned about the ego of the elder in the door of the church whose sense of power and authority and control had somehow been insulted by my children, my little children's refusal to sort of give the accolade or the allegiance that was necessary to the elder. There's a competition there of important values, and I've always said to my children, I want you, especially you, the women in my family, I want you to pay attention to your instincts, because I think women in particular have been trained and conditioned not to pay attention to them in order to give the allegiance that's necessary to power. There it is. There's my whole foundation, and it was from years and years ago. I wish I could tell you that was the one and only time when I have had tangles like this in church, and it is not. At that same church, a few times later, we had one elderly man who was taking liberties in terms of his physical inappropriateness with women. In that church, there was an opportunity that this man saw. In order to get into the sanctuary, you had to cross a very busy county road. So we all parked on this side, and then we all got out of our cars, and we had to go to the side of the street at the crosswalk, and there was a police officer there who would then stop traffic and allow us to cross, but he would only allow it to happen after a group had accumulated. So this man, in the occasion of that grouping, took an opportunity to touch women inappropriately. And because of the crowd, sometimes women who had been touched thought, oh, well, that wasn't intentional. And he was able, in that time, to get away with it a lot. He was able to do this, which my read of it is, he was finding a way to show that he was powerful, that he had the ability to cross boundaries, that he could invade someone else's sense of space and therefore safety, and that he was immune. Immune because the culture doesn't really like it when people talk about it, when they raise a red flag or they push a bell and say, hey, somebody inappropriately just touched me. And then, of course, you know how this goes. The person who makes the complaint then becomes the victim of a whole pressure of orderly behavior that says, why are you making such a fuss? Now in that case, there was one woman in particular who decided that when she was getting out of her car to come to church, she in no way was going to tolerate this invasion of her personal space. She just came to that conclusion and said, I'm not going to tolerate this anymore. And she had to overcome all of her worry about what would happen to her position of standing in the church if she complained or if she insisted on finding out who this was, and even more importantly, insisted that it stop. Because she knew that she wasn't the only one who was being violated in this way. She also knew that in spite of what anybody might think, and the ability of some people to say, oh, for goodness sake, that's not that bad of a thing to have happen. She knew what it felt like to her. She knew that she was beginning to have trouble even getting up and getting ready and coming to church because the church no longer felt like a sanctuary. The church now felt like a place she was going into where it was a battlefield. And that after she had gotten touched the last time, she spent the entire time in church unable to hear the hymns, unable to hear the sermon, unable to really joyfully enter into the community of the sanctuary of the church because she was going through an inventory of herself. What is wrong with me that this bothers me? What is wrong with me? What is wrong with the church that this is happening? Why doesn't somebody do something about this? And so here, my friends, is one of the reasons why the church must deal with this when it happens. Because people can physically come to church but someone's violation of their own personal space, violation of other people's space, and then the community's sort of ignorance, willful ignorance that it happens, or when it is described, the ability of men in particular, I'm sorry to say it, but men in particular to laugh it off, and women sometimes trying to say, oh, for goodness sake, there are bigger things to worry about. Now I always am accused of not finishing the story. She came to the church council and she demanded to talk to the church council about what was happening. There then was an inquiry, subtly an inquiry put out, not first as a response, but it occurred to me, that's to find out how many other people were silently suffering in this way. How many other people had this man touched? How many other experiences for church had been ruined? How many people were staying home? How many people were staying home because they did not believe that the church, A, would take it seriously, well, how damaging and how demoralizing it felt, and then also it was doing no good to come to church anyway because they were spending their whole time avoiding having it happen to them. They weren't in church. So we did some investigation. We did some inquiries. And when we asked, we found what we didn't want to know. We asked people who were coming to church, have you had this experience? Yes. Is it a factor? Yes, it's a serious factor. I have to figure out how to steel myself to overcome that. And I also shelter my children from seeing it happen. This is not a little wayward, church in the backwoods somewhere where you can imagine in your prejudices that there's a familiarity with violation of boundaries. This was a mainline church of all good and decent and appropriate people, and secretly in the confines of its sanctuary there was this eroding, power-hungry person who was damaging the sanctuary of the church. Now, before too long, we knew who it was. It wasn't that large of a church. And then, of course, we went into the whole discussions about what were we going to do about it. As I think is typical, this was a person who was perceived of, although he was older now, he was still perceived as a fairly important person in terms of the structure of the church. He was connected through family, he was connected through his contributions to the church. And so, of course, there are always those in the meeting where we talked about what to do who were worried about the consequences for him and worried about the consequences for the church. Those worries will not make the church safe for people. What will make the church safe for people is when we learn that boundaries are being crossed, that people are being assaulted, that their sense of safety is being violated and then being covered over. Our first concern cannot be for the survival of the church. It cannot be. And you've seen this played out over and over again. And I know I'm talking in what I think is a little talked about community of the safety of the church. But you've heard this played out in terms of other contexts in churches. You've heard that, and I don't mean this as if the Roman Catholic Church is the only church that experiences these kinds of abuses. Far from it. There's nothing Catholic, uniquely Catholic, about the abuse of a pastor in power having vulnerable people, young people, and then needing to exercise that power and to rehearse in themselves that they still have that power. That's what the Bible calls oppression. That is what this sophisticated religious word in the Bible. God hates oppressors. That's what oppression is. It's people who take power given to them appropriately and then feel the need to exercise it in arenas where it's inappropriate, and then also exercise it in abundance in order to reassure the insecurity, the personal insecurity that comes with power. It opens up an insecurity, believe it or not. So in the Roman Catholic Church, you've heard worldwide, another global pandemic. The abuse that takes place among trusted religious leaders of trusting parishioners, families that trusted their children to the priests. And then, what connects for where I'm talking now is, then the institution's instincts for its own survival. How it was imagined that the news of this abuse would somehow affect the survival of the church, and so the church works together not to respond to the building of safety and community for its parishioners, but instead for some imagined, higher, invented thought of its own, of the institution's safety and security. And you know, because it's playing out right in front of our eyes, how foolish it is to think that that's a way of creating and carrying out this idea of what will help the church to survive. And then go into educational institutions. You've seen and heard universities that put their entire future on the line by covering up these abuses of power. Some of them, you might say, oh, that's much worse. You cannot compare this. Societies and organizations that respond in inappropriate ways for their self-survival at the sacrifice of the safety and security and sanity of the individual participants. I don't know, I could wax into biblical language and say, the biblical prophets will say, they shall not stand. They shall not stand. Because God is the God of the Bible is a God who is on the side in compassion and in comfort and creating security. And God is in favor of institutions. God is in favor of them and believes that leadership is needed. Oh, we are like sheep. We need leaders. We do. But read the Bible where the writers, the prophets, the teachers, the prayers talk about God's attitude towards those who are given authority and power and then abuse it. No, God is no longer concerned for the survival of the institution. God is more concerned with the safety, the sanctity, and the protection of the people. Because this is the God of the Bible. He is the God of the people. And promises sure ruin for those who cast that concern aside. So that leadership team in that church decided that they were going to have to take the risk, and they were going to have to confront this person. And on first blush, being talked to about it, he laughed about it. He did not, I don't know if he didn't take it seriously or he wanted to make sure that the church council wasn't going to take it seriously. And in the end, I can tell you, because it wasn't quick, but in the end it led to several people from the church leaving the church because they felt that this person was just kidding, all of it. So we lost some families in the church. We had to end up drawing a boundary with him and saying that he was no longer able to come to church. And what we didn't know for sure, and we couldn't really measure, is how many people breathed a sigh of relief. And how many people could finally come to church and not wonder when and where and who today would experience this kind of an abuse. So that's why that's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about making the church safe. But it goes to what we're doing today in response to this COVID-19. The church, a community that is created in the Spirit of God, is a community that when that when the time for its essential values are at stake, is willing, quote, to risk its own life. The Book of Order is profound in the Presbyterian Church, in our Constitution. The Book of Order has, in the preamble, leading into the whole structure of discipline and theology of the church, the Book of Order has a beautiful paragraph in which it describes that the mission of the church, and you read it and you think, wait, what are they talking about? But that the mission of the church of compassion, of seeking justice, and of working for the sheltering of humanity, of working for the causes of God in the world, the church is so wedded to this mission of creating sanctuary and safety in the world. And then it says the key words. It must do this even at the risk of its own life. It must do this even if the consequences are the loss of the institution itself. And then the Book of Order goes right to the most powerful imagery in the Christian theology, which is because we are followers of the Lord Jesus Christ, who laid down his life that we might know life, that we might know hope and security and healing and life. Think about that. Just think for a moment about that. The writers laying a brick in the wall of the foundation of the church lend their hand, lend their minds, lend their hearts to this idea that it is the mission of the church which makes it worth sustaining. It is that call to Sarah and Abraham that you are called to be a blessing to the families of the earth. But you are not a blessing. We are not, as churches, congregations, or denominations, we are not blessings to the families of the earth if we put our fingers in our ear to the experience of what people are receiving in the life of the church, and then work for just the preservation of the institution. So, here's the laboratory of our learning. We are called upon. I remember I think it will be 3 weeks ago soon, when we were summoned by the mayor of our town, along with the public health director. They called together all the religious leaders they could identify. And they asked us, we're going to ask you to do something we know is very difficult and painful to you. But we're going to ask you, this was a Thursday, would you please suspend all of your gatherings? Would you please do that? And there was like this quietness among the meeting, and we began to realize then the seriousness of what they believed was coming our way. And they talked a little bit. The mayor's assistant said in particular, he was very sensitive to saying, we know how important the gatherings of the faith community not only are to you, but they are to our society. But we are asking you, even given that it may bring real hardship to the survival of your institutions, would you be willing to suspend all of your gatherings and your religious practices? In the quietness of that, the rabbi, who was a representative of an organization of synagogues, spoke and said, he raised his verbal hand and said, I will do this. We will do this. And then he said, it's not because we don't value our sacred gatherings. He said, you would know that of us, how important the gatherings are for us. We have bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs which are planned. We have big celebrations that are planned, and we have our regular Sabbath gatherings. We will now promise to suspend them all. This is where the power of our calling as faith communities was unleashed. He said, we will do that because our higher calling has always been beyond the institutions that we serve. It has always been a higher calling to the people of the world. Their safety, their life, their protection, And I was blown away. The power of it washed over me, and I began to see in practice what I know happens in practice many, many, many times in the institutions of the church. During Hurricane Floyd, the congregation that I served at the time was a high Presbyterian church. They loved their sanctuary. They loved everything they possessed. They were very, very careful. When they served the communion on Sunday mornings, the servers wore white gloves, and they had, solid silver service, and everything was in order. But I remember the days after the devastation of a flood that destroyed 3 towns and wrecked all of the social order, the willingness of the leadership there to throw open the doors of the church, the building of the church. I know there was damage that was done to the church. The things got lost, probably things got stolen. It was a huge upheaval in the life of the church. I think it was 265 people came into the walls of the sanctuary of the church. They lived there for 14 days. They ate there. They celebrated there. They got to know each other there. And the church, while it lost in terms of structure and all the kinds of things that we normally celebrated, the church was carrying out its mission. And my hope is that around these issues that I haven't really talked that much about, but they are there, my friends. You need to understand them. You probably experienced them. That this ability of the church to brush aside the safety and the personal space of people who want to come to church and worship, and then to brush aside concerns about that, or to be unwilling to even entertain. That as leaders of the church, we need to be vigilant about this issue. Once our church got kind of ready, we had to be made ready to do this. Our leadership began to take an inventory. We had our own particular versions of this crossing grabber. And we were like, at first we were like, well, this can't be a problem. This can't really be true. And then we began to find out that the accommodation that was made in the life of our church was massive. On the parts of people who were silently aware that, yes, they liked the preaching, they liked the music, they liked many things. We have handicapped accessibility. We've done some of the things that were hard-fought battles. I don't know why. In the life of the church, we have large print hymnals. We go a long way to say this is a place for you to come. But when these kinds of issues of people who are out of control with their inability to keep their hands to themselves or to not say things that disrupt the personal safety and sanctuary of people who come to church, we freeze. And we worry more about the consequences to the institution than we do to the safety and well-being of the people who make up the institution. These are days. These are the days, my friends. That's why I said in making the plan, there was a part of me that kept saying, keep thinking, because there is a deep connection between the church's willingness, the synagogue's willingness, the mosque's willingness to set aside everything that sustains us. We don't know. I've been in meetings with leaders. We don't know where our financial future is. We don't know if people who've lost their jobs will be able to continue to support us. We don't know if we will have to shrink like many corporations to 1/3 of the size. But I will tell you, one thing I hear as a resolve across congregations is when it comes to protecting and preserving safety for God's children, for the people of the world, the church should lead the way. The church should be willing, like the Book of Order says, at all costs, even at the cost of its own life, move as God moves across the face of the earth to provide sanctuary. The Lord is my shepherd. so I shall not know want. I can lie down in green pastures. I'll find a way to be led to safe water. These are the images that gave rise to the church. These are the promises the church makes. So I will leave you with this one thought then. Ultimately, when the time comes for you, and you're listening and you're hearing about circumstances of people who are describing a kind of a Me Too movement in the life of the church, and believe me, it needs to be opened up. It needs to be opened up, and the way to open it up is that if you hear people who take the risk and express to you a concern about someone, about comments that are being made to that person, or about inappropriate touching, and you'd be with me 100% more if I was just talking about children today, but I am also talking about children. It's one of the reasons that when we take children away, we do background checks on everybody. We've been doing it for years. We don't make assumptions, and we don't make assumptions because in those assumptions is the safety of children and of families and of worshipers and of older people. We need to adopt a whole new way of being vigilant for sanctuary. And not see it somehow as an annoying thing of, this contemporary time, we're worried about everything. But no, we're not. We are only beginning, my friends, to carry out our mission to create a sanctuary that is safe. Safe for people of different races, of different languages. Safe for people of different color of skin. Safe of members of the opposite sex. Safe so that when there is an imbalance of power, and there are people in power, that we are willing to hold those people, whether it's formal or informal power, hold them accountable to the standards that make the church safe for everyone. I had hoped on this particular topic to then lead into a couple of other classes where we would bring in some experts who can talk about this reality and its effect that it's having, the damaging effect that it's having on the safety and security and gathering of the church. And I hope to still be able to do that at some point. Our church umbrella insurance company has speakers who can come and talk to us. Of course, their concern is always to be worried that you're going to be sued, and I think that's a secondary concern. The first concern is the person. The first concern is that individual sense. We have responded to our own particular known threat. We don't believe for a moment that we're all now simply really good at boundaries. We need to be better. We need to be conscious. We need to raise our consciousness about how we talk to each other, and to be concerned about another person's response to what we do and what we say. We need to be aware that a hug is not always a hug, that a handshake is not always a handshake, that a kiss is not always a kiss. And is that disappointing? I don't know. Maybe it is. If it's an awakening beyond your ideal world, then so what? Then awaken beyond it. Let it come to us to be aware that the reason we cry out for sanctuary is because it can be achieved. And when it's not achieved, we can also be brave and respond in a way that restores people in the experience of it. Thank you for tuning in today. I always miss you in the dialogue in this experience, but as you can see, I'm not without things to say and stories to tell, and I hope that they're helpful to you. I hope they expand your thinking about the church, and I hope too that they reassure you about the leadership of this community and its willingness to be vigilant. If you are a person that's experiencing some kind of an invasion of your space or your safety, I want you to know you can come and talk to me. You can talk to the elders of the church. Talk to your neighbors and ask them to help you to be strong. Because what safety you seek for yourself, you'll also be making for others. God bless you in your safety-seeking place today, and in your keeping your neighbor safe as you stay home and isolate. God bless you. Worship begins in just 15 minutes.